Is this like an application for a burger shop or like an insurance broker or I don't know, I'm just trying to come up with a name for the project. We don't have to think too hard about this.
An electronics store.
Electronics. Okay. So I'm going to make a virtual environment. So I've already got my folder for virtual environments at ~/venvs. I'm going to just create a new virtual environment for electronics. And actually, before I forget, I'm going to stop this infinite loop here. Well, not infinite, but gonna crash out of that because I don't know, my computer is thinking way too hard about that. Anyways, I got my virtual environment. Now we will activate it. Great, so now I can see that my prompt has changed, so I know I'm in my electronics environment. Now that I'm in the virtual environment, I can install stuff. The first thing that I know I need is going to be Django. So we'll pip install Django. Okay, so now that I've got Django, I can use Django to scaffold out a project. Use Python -m Django, start project, electronics project. Cool, so there's my project. I'm going to cd into there. So now I can see I've got my manage.py file, which I'm going to use from now on instead of Python -m Django. And I've got my folder for the electronics project, which is going to have all the, like the config and settings for my application. So I'm going to try to do this with some proper Django structure. So I'm going to create an app also that's going to have my business logic. So we'll run start app, and we're going to call it electronics app, just to help us keep things straight between the project and the app. All right, so this looks like a decent folder structure. I'm going to open this up in my editor. Then we're going to try to run the application, make sure that I haven't messed anything up already. So let's see if we can run the server, and no, we cannot, because I'm not using my virtual environment here. So let me do that. Source. Cool, so now I'm using my virtual environment in this terminal as well, because like I mentioned before, the virtual environment activation is specific to the terminal in which you run that command. So let's try this one more time. Gonna run the server. All right, so it looks like that's working. Let's go to localhost 8000, see what we can see. Cool. So this is just my basic Django hello world, pretty much. So it looks like I'm ready now to actually add some custom application logic. So let's see, in my settings file, before I forget, I know that I need to add an app for my electronics app here. I need to register it so that it can find the templates and routes and views and everything associated with this app. All right, so next I want to make a custom home page. Don't want to just use this default Django page. So I got to set up my URLs. Let's see, I always forget how to do this. So I'm going to open up a previous project. So what do I have? Okay, yeah, so I just need to get path and include from Django.urls. I could have just Googled it just to figure out, where can I import include from, but I figured it'd be faster to just get my previous project. So this is going to be at the root of our project. And these URLs are going to come from electronics app.urls, which does not exist. Django is already, freaking out and yelling at me that I've referred to something that doesn't exist. So I'm just going to make that real quick. Electronics app needs to have a urls.py, because that's what I'm referring to here, electronics app.urls. So I need to create that file here. And again, I'm going to look at my previous project for inspiration. So here in the app, urls.py, yeah, we had something kind of like this. All right, so now this is referring to a file that actually exists. Great. But now in my URLs for the app, I'm trying to refer to a function that I have not written yet. So in my views, that's this adjacent file here, I'm going to have to create a function called index. And again, I'm just going to copy this index method, including all these import statements. Because I just don't always remember offhand exactly where everything gets imported from. So I'm just going to check real quick here that I can actually get a response from my index view. Okay, cool. So that looks like that's working. But so instead of just sending down plain text, I would like to render a template. So we're going to say response equals render electronics app / index.html. Don't have any data to pass in yet. But this template does not exist. I've referred to a template that I've not yet created. So if I just try to load the page, we're going to get an error. Template does not exist. So let's make it exist. So I need to create a new folder now in my electronics app. going to create a folder for templates. Then in there, we're going to have to create a subfolder for the app that the templates belong to, which I know it seems redundant, but this is how Django works. And then inside of this folder, we'll actually create my index.html. Yeah, actually, while we're at it, I'm gonna do some extensible layout for y'all because I just think that's cool. So this is actually going to be my layout.html. Got our HTML tag in here, the head, body. All right, so our electronics store is going to be called Better Buy because it's just a little bit better than Best Buy. All right, so this is, okay, what am I doing? So this is the layout HTML. I'm not supposed to have any specific content in here. Getting ahead of myself. So all we need here is block content. I think I need to end block. What was the syntax for that actually? Yeah, end block. I was correct, but I just wasn't confident. The title here. Okay, so there's my layout.html. So then I'm going to need to create my actual index that's going to fill in these blocks. So first I need to tell Django that these files are related, that my index.html should be inserted inside of layout. So first things first, you need to declare that this extends layout. And I don't understand why the autocomplete keeps removing these braces. All right, so then we will declare our block. So here we can put some actual content.
Hey, Raphael, while you're doing that, let's say there was some, bar you wanted in the middle of your page, on every single page, but you wanted to be able to have varying content above and below. You make multiple block contents in your layout then, and then just put, or could you include like something static in your layout and then put a block content above and below that, or could you do that?
I would probably do something like,
Okay, so the end block is always the same regardless for that syntax. Is that the case? I was asking.
I'm sorry, I missed your question. Can you repeat that?
I was asking, so we have to essentially match up the top block content, but the end block is always the same regardless of the name of the block. I'm just trying to
Right.
clarify.
Yeah, you don't
Okay.
name the block when you end it.
Okay, thank you.
I guess it's almost like a closing curly brace, like in JavaScript. It just closes the thing that was opened previously. Might have been a function, might have been a loop, but whatever it is, this closes it.
Will it throw an error if you don't change the name? Like if you just have one block, end block, another block, end block, but they're named the same thing, will it throw an error?
I think so. Like the blocks have to be
They have
unique.
to be different. Okay.
Try put in the HTML and in quotes layout.html on
Let me
line
just
1.
double check what I did here. Oh, right. I forgot to put the app name in the folder. So yeah, because I don't have layout.html inside of templates. I have layout.html inside of electronics app inside of templates. And am I forgetting something else? In quotes, let's try that. Okay, cool. So we actually got it going now. So we can see here the top content, and then the HR is just hard coded into the layout. And then we have bottom content.
Can you go back to your layout folder? Okay.
So let's see, what do we need next here? I would like to add some CSS, I think. I don't like all this white space here. At least it could be empty blue space or something. So we need, well, first I'm gonna write a link tag into our layout. So yeah, every single page on this site should have the main CSS loaded into it. All right, but right now this file does not exist and my server isn't even set up to serve static files anyway. So I need to set that up. So I'm going to make a folder at the root of my project called static. Wait, this is not the root of my project. New folder called static. And then inside of here, we will create a folder for CSS. Then inside of there, I'll create my main.css. I was trying for mauve, but apparently medium aquamarine is a color. I don't know what that looks like. We'll find out. All right, but currently it's not working. Getting some 404s. If I look at the network tab, main.css is giving me an error. We can't find this file. So I'm gonna poll the audience here. Can anyone remember from our previous lectures, what's the next thing I need to do in order to actually serve this CSS file?
You have to go into your settings.py and link the base directory for static files.
Yeah, so this is not the default location for static files, so I need to tell Django where I've put them.
What is the default for static files?
It's supposed to be inside of the app folder. So there would be like electronics app / static, I think then / electronics app / CSS / whatever. For some reason, I've never gotten that to work for me. And honestly, like when you go to deploy your application, you need to set it up like this anyway. So there's a step at the end to like move all of your static files and copy them into a folder at the root of your project. So I just kind of skip a step and set up my project to begin with the way that it's going to be when I deploy it. This doesn't cause me any headaches or any problems, and I feel like it's just easier overall.
So is your static sitting alongside your project in your app?
Yeah.
Okay.
Electronics app,
And then just so
electronics
small.
project.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Manage.py, and then static's right there.
That's fair. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
How do you, well, I guess, how would you, if you have multiple apps in the same project, I guess, and they all have their own static, then you'd have them named differently, or you just have?
I mean,
I guess this orientation doesn't work that way, does it?
you can still put all of the static files for your entire application into one folder.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, because you're only calling what you need. That makes sense. Never mind. Thanks.
Yeah, each app has a URL or like a file path. It knows what it's looking for. Just as long as you don't have different apps that have different files with the same name, then you might have problems. So like if every one of your apps has a main.css file and it's a different file, that's going to give you trouble. But that's not what we're doing here. All right, so I just copied this right from the Django documentation, just saying static file dirs are going to be in the base directory / static. So, you know, the Django folks are already kind of expecting that somebody might want to do this. And so their example for customizing the static files directory is putting it right here. And that's what I'm going to do. So now we've got this URL that we can request static files at, and Django knows what folder those are supposed to come out of. And in the layout HTML, we've got our style sheet linked in. So if I've done everything correctly, we should get a colored background. Amazing. So I've linked in my CSS file. Cool. What do we want to see next?
APIs.
Okay, let's get some APIs up in here. So there should probably be a form on the first page so that the front end can tell our back end what it's looking for. So let's see, I need to add some JavaScript to my application, but this JavaScript doesn't go on every page. It's just the one specific page that, you know, we should be able to search on. So I'm going to add another block here to my layout. Call it scripts. So now in my index.html, I can add a script that'll get put right in this section here at the end of the head.
So what would have happened if you hadn't added that block stuff to your layout page? You couldn't just put it in index.html without that?
I mean, index.html doesn't have a head.
Oh, right, okay.
I mean, I could, in theory, just put it right over here, but that would be the same as like putting a script at the end of the body, which is valid, but it's not what I want to do. That's not how I want to build this. I want all my scripts to be in the head, and then I'll defer them if they don't need to load immediately when the page loads. Cool, but now that script doesn't exist, so I'm going to have to create it. So it should be in our static folder, create a new folder for JavaScript. And inside of my JS folder, create a main.js. So let's just console log, make sure this is actually hooked up correctly. So no longer getting a 404 error, got the high in the console. So that looks like that's hooked up correctly. Great. So like I was saying, I want to have a form so the user can, tell the backend what it's curious about. So I'm going to put this in the bottom content. So they're going to type in a product and try to search our electronics store for it. I'm going to give a 4 on the label, so I can click on the label and it should focus the input. Right, so now we need to be able to send this data to our backend. So I need to handle submit events on this form. Actually, first I need a submit button. Does that look right? Yeah, this looks like a form. Cool, I can click on the text here and that focuses the input. But submitting it doesn't actually do anything useful yet. So I have to write some code for that. Justin, you got a question?
I do. It's about these templates and the relationship between CSS and JavaScript. So if you have a layout and you have an index like this and you're doing templating in Django, if you have a as your CSS is being called in your layout, and you write some JavaScript that would rewrite an attribute that you've set in your index CSS, how would you make sure that when you're running your index file, the JavaScript happens after it loads this static CSS for the template? You know what I mean? I was having issues when I was doing this where I wrote CSS that would rewrite an attribute for a object that I had in CSS. I wrote JavaScript to rewrite an attribute, and it wouldn't take because it would end up reloading the CSS static over after my JavaScript happened. So like, what decides when things happen? Because you're jumping between pages and you're causing things to reload with these templates.
I'm not sure if I understand your question, actually. So
Okay.
right now I only have one page. It's just the home
Yeah.
page. There's a couple of different templates that are used to compose it, but
Oh,
yeah, like I'm refreshing this page sometimes, which will, make us lose the JavaScript context and cause everything to reload. But other than that, there's just one page on this application.
oh,
I think it's also important to point out that the front end, the browser, does not know or care that Django is using templates, because by the time it gets to the browser, it's just a single HTML document.
Yeah, do you want to show the network request that has the HTML doc?
Yeah, it's just this request. And this is what gets sent from the server.
Yeah, that's all that the browser sees with regards to HTML. And you can see, in fact, on the left, 3 files that have everything that the browser is aware of. Thanks. I just always find that helpful, so I wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, I always like looking at the network tab to, just see what's actually coming in and out of my browser. Because there's so many abstractions we deal with, so many like things that happen automatically right before you send your data and right before you receive it. So you kind of lose touch with what's actually getting transmitted over the internet. So I think it's good to look in the network tab to see what your computer is actually sending and receiving.
Totally. Yeah. And I know, especially when we're learning this stuff, like getting clear on what's being executed server side and what's being executed client side in the browser, especially when we're doing it all in like a dev environment and it's all on one machine, can be confusing. And the network tab is a great tool to help clarify that, I think.
can you chain extensions?
How do you mean?
So you have your layout, and then you have your index extending off of it. Can you then have another page extending off of your index? Was there any reason to do that? No?
I'm not sure what that would accomplish,
Okay.
or if it's even possible. I've never thought about that.
Okay. So I guess what I'm gathering is, if you want to incorporate JavaScript, I guess if you have your layout and you have a CSS file written to design it, you would have that being called in your layout. But then if you have JavaScript that makes any changes to that CSS, you would add that into your extension HTML as a script that would then load in when you call that extension.
It just depends on
like you
which
did, right?
pages you want it to run on. Like anything you put in the layout.html is going to run on every single page. Whereas things in the individual like index.html or another partial file is only going to run on that particular page.
Does your JavaScript here take precedence over any CSS you have in your layout if you were to change an attribute?
I mean, I'd say the CSS loads first, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to
Layout, and
add to
then there's-
that. The right way to think about the JavaScript, it's not as a question of precedence, but like Raphael, exactly what you were saying, like the CSS gets loaded first. First of all, usually when we have JavaScript interact with the browser in the DOM, we wouldn't like modify a CSS style sheet that the browser has received. The browser would talk to the DOM and like directly modify stuff on the DOM. And so if you're changing how something looks, like the browser is looking at the CSS page and using that to build up the DOM and apply these CSS rules, and then we might modify the DOM, however the DOM like holds CSS rules for like a particular node, like for a paragraph tag or something like that. Like it'd be unlikely for the browser to actually like modify an existing CSS file. And if it did, actually, you would have to refresh the page because the browser has already loaded that CSS file, and there's no way for the browser to get changes to that without refreshing the
see.
page. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right, because if you do it in JavaScript, it's actually just writing it straight into the HTML as a
Yeah.
style.
Yeah, you could actually, I don't know if JavaScript can like access the source files or not in the browser,
okay.
but you wouldn't do that. And if you did, it'd be self-defeating because you'd have to refresh the page. And when you refresh the page, the browser would just grab the original HTML and CSS files from the
Right.
server. Anyway, there's more to it than that, but that's like the basics. Yeah, the browser is going to talk to the DOM and modify stuff on there to change stuff. Yeah, sorry, I apologize, Raphael, if that was too much of a shift.
Oh, you're good.
Cool.
Thank you.
So let's see, where are we now? All right, so I need to make this form actually submit. Let's see, so I gave an ID to this form, is the search form. So we will get the element. We'll add an event listener when we submit the form. And then here's what we're going to do. First things first, prevent the default behavior because we do not want the default form submission behavior to occur pretty much ever. Let's just console.log. Well, so I'm going to grab the input. And what did I call this guy? Product. So if I type phone, okay, cool. So I'm able to access the value of whatever I type into the input. So next, I think I'm going to try to send this data up to my server. Dalton?
Yeah, I'm just curious because it was something that I had ran into and I could not get it to work. So if you were to say you were to go to a link and you had like someone had already put something in that text field, because you clicked that link, would you still be able to access that by doing exactly what you just did, or would it get wiped away because of the new GET request?
I'm a little confused. Can you try that again?
So like if you typed phone right there, but say you typed phone, but then for whatever reason, there was maybe a link on the side of it that you can also click. If you click that link, would you still be able to pull the data from the input field, or would it get erased?
I mean, yeah, if I click a link and it navigates the page away, then we would like lose this whole JavaScript context.
Okay. So there's probably just no way to do something like that then?
I mean, there are ways that you can like run code right before you transition away.
Okay.
So, I mean, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. There might be ways to do things.
Cool. Thank you.
So let's see. Alicia?
This method that you're covering of getting the input value from the HTML via JavaScript, this is the way that you said is the best way to combine the JavaScript and Django, right? Because I know that at one point last week we had covered using Django to send information from your form to a URL path that was then handled by a function and then rendered that data on the HTML. But this was the way you recommended instead of that method process, right?
I mean, there are a lot of ways that you can send data from your front end to your back end. I think this is pretty simple and straightforward. Like, I like preventing the default form submission and just using Axios to send data. That gives me kind of flexibility and control to do exactly what I want. If I was sending more than one piece of data up to the server, then I might use a slightly different flow here in the front end, just because like this would be a little bit tedious if I was trying to grab like 20 or 40 inputs just individually by ID. So I might find a way to just loop through everything in the form and then have a more like standardized kind of way of sending that data back. But for what I'm doing here, that's a little bit overkill.
Okay, and just to, I think we only did, I could be wrong, but I feel like we only did Axios specifically to access an API with our Pokemon project. Here you made it sound like you would use Axios outside of that functionality. Is that correct? Or did you only use it to request from an API?
I would use Axios for basically any HTTP request. I think we might have seen it before with a traditional form submission. And it's definitely good for you all to see that because it's important to me that you know how forms actually work in HTML. Just the basic form without any JavaScript. But practically speaking, as we're building applications, I'm going to prefer to use Axios to send requests from the front end, whether that's to my own backend or to someone else's backend, to a third-party API.
Okay, thanks.
So now I could put the script for Axios in my index.html, but I think it's pretty likely that I'm going to use Axios on every page of the site as it gets bigger. So I'm just going to put that in my layout instead. Go to the CDN, grab a link. Okay. Now that I've loaded Axios into my layout HTML, I can use it on any page, including the index. So we will post to, what's a good URL to post this to? Honestly, if this is just a query, if we're just searching for things, but we're not updating the server, I'm going to send this with a GET request instead. So we're doing axios.get to and then we're going to include some data in the request. So whatever's the value of the search input, we're going to call that the query. Ideally, we get a response from the server. Let's just log it. All right, so that's going to give me a 404 because I have not created this URL yet. My server doesn't know how to handle requests to products. Actually, let me take a closer look at that. So I'm kind of wondering if it actually was able to include this data successfully. Alicia, do you have a question?
Yeah, can you go back to that page? Your code. So for me, it really helps out if you like define what the purpose of each section of like your syntax here is. So the axios.get is what's going to, okay, I don't know, but products, that's the page you're wanting to send the data to, right? That's where your .then response will go to. And then the query is where you're saying, I want to get this value. Is that right?
So this is data I want to send to my server. It's going to be like a tiny little dictionary. Query is just the key. I've just kind of made that up right here. More importantly, the value is the value from this search input on the page.
Okay. Okay, so you're saying I want to send this dictionary with whatever I type in to, and is that what becomes your response or no? What's the
This is
response
the
part?
request. Everything up here, this is the request. This is what we're sending to our server. And then this function here is how we handle the response.
I think I'm getting confused because when you're saying request, to me, that's like grab, but then you're saying send. So they sound like opposite things. Does that make sense?
I mean, like the front and the back end are, you know, on opposite sides of the country, potentially. Like we can't just take things from the server. We have to send a request over to them and ask for things, and then they'll send something back.
Request, yeah, it's a little bit of, in this context, it specifically means making an HTTP request.
Okay.
So when you talk about the front end, that's actually physically the user's like computer, their web browser. Is that right?
Yeah,
Because the JavaScript is everything is loaded into their browser now.
it's all the hardware that you don't own.
Okay, and so in this case, because you're in the JavaScript file here, that is going to be on the front end, which could be wherever the user is located.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, should we run this in the browser and watch it make the request? I don't know if that step would help visualize things or not.
Okay, so just hit me with it one more time, what each section is doing.
So here, this first line is just sending a GET request. To /products on our server. And we're also sending search input .value as data to our server.
Where are you sending?
So this is extra data that we are sending to our backend.
So, but like, where would we grab that value in the backend?
In a view handler for /products, which has not been written yet.
Okay.
I think if we look, can we throw this, can we go to our browser and like maybe even look at the source file for the JS and then in the network tab, watch it make the request and then just step through the whole flow of it going from here to the server side code?
I mean, we're not going to get a round trip yet.
Oh yeah.
I still have not written the server side component of this.
So does Axios Git replace the request in your views file? Would that be a way to say that? Or do you still need both?
I mean, they perform similar functions, but they do it from different places. So Axios sends requests from my front end from JavaScript, whereas the requests library sends a request from Python. So
So would you still have to use both, or if you're sending it from the front end with JavaScript, when you write your views URL, do you no longer need to pass in the request, or how does that work?
well, yeah, I'm gonna have to use both here because I'm not reaching out to any API directly from my front end. The front end is just going to my back end. Then my back end is gonna have to
Oh.
reach out to an API.
Okay, so you'll take what you got in the front end and use it in the back end, essentially. That's, I guess, what we're putting all together.
Right. So the front end is not querying the API. The front end is just telling my back end how to query the API.
Cool, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, sort of the context here of why we do this is, let's imagine that like the API we want to talk to requires like an authentication token and maybe, you know, an account name or something. And that's secure information. Like, we don't want to like necessarily put the authentication token for some third API. We don't want to, if we put that in our JavaScript, this whole JavaScript file gets sent to the browser. So anyone on the internet who opens up this page and has it in the browser can go to the sources tab and look at this JavaScript code. It's right there. And so like that auth token, authentication token, is sort of a secure piece of information that we want to keep on the server side. There are other reasons too, but this way it's like the browser passing the data onto the server, and we're setting it up so that, exactly like you were saying, Raphael, the server can fetch it and make the secure connection with some other API and then send it back to the browser, to the user, wherever the user is. And that way the user has no knowledge or access of this third-party API. Was that helpful, or was that too much, folks?
I think it's good to keep
Yeah,
in
we've
mind.
covered that, so that was good reminder.
Cool.
So definitely make a lot more sense when we finish this function here and we can actually make a round trip. See, we're sending a GET request to /products. So I got to handle that on the back end. So let's go to urls.py. Need a new path. This is products. So views.products. Now I've got to define that function. It's going to take in the request as always. Is JSON response in here? Yeah, okay. So I'm just testing it out, making sure I can get something back. Searching for phones. Okay, so I got a response. Is that what I wanted? Yeah, okay, data, we got it. Okay, so that's what I was looking for. Not exactly sure where I got redirected here. I think this is just about trailing slashes or something. Because I wrote this with a trailing slash, but in my main.js, this URL does not have a trailing slash. So maybe Django is just being really particular about that, and it automatically redirects it from the one without the trailing slash to the one with the trailing slash. I feel like this shouldn't matter, but if I just take off that slash there. Okay, so now it's not redirecting me. I don't think that matters, but makes my network tab look a little bit cleaner. Okay, so now I'm getting the round trip, but I need to actually inspect this data from the server side. So instead of just sending a generic response, just got it, I need to look at the request. And this is a GET request, so it can't have a body. So I need to look for the data in the query string. So the data is going to be in the URL somehow, either in URL parameters or in the query string, but it's not going to be in the body because GET requests don't have bodies. So let's see if request.get has what I'm looking for. And it seems to be empty. Should have something called query on it, which is what I'm expecting. And it does not. So
You had to put query in quotes. Not right there on your JavaScript page, since it's a key.
keys in JavaScript do not need quotes, only in Python.
Oh, right.
In JavaScript, keys are always strings. And so it's just such a strong assumption that as a convenience to you as a developer, you don't have to put the quotes here.
That was so 5 weeks ago, FIL. My brain is on this week. But no, I remember now. Thank you.
Yep. You're welcome. Okay, so for whatever reason, this data is not getting transmitted up to the server. I'm not sure if I'm just forgetting the Axios syntax. So we're gonna do some Googling.
I was gonna say we could do a quick console log or something in the JS code too.
Potentially, I feel like I just need something different in this second argument here.
Gotcha.
And I see it on the server.
Gotcha. Oh, is it the params?
Yeah. So I'm not gonna just put in, so it's not like the second argument is just all the parameters, but the second argument is options. And one option is params. Incidentally, it's the only option we're gonna use here, I think. So yeah, this is kind of a simple example here. So in this case, the server would receive answer 42. So let's see if that does anything. Do we have phones? Okay, so this is looking a lot better. So now I can see in the URL that was requested, it's products and then question mark query equals phone. So phone being what I typed in here, and then query is just what I hard coded as the key for my data. So Axios is converting this a little bit for me. I just passed in an object here saying it's got params. It's this dictionary query with a search input value. And then Axios is automatically tacking that onto the end of the URL. like so. But I don't have to deal with all this finicky syntax. Axios does that for me automatically. Oh, and also we can see here in the console. So this is what Python is seeing in our views.py. When we print a response get query, we can see phone. So this is what the user was asking for. So now that our backend is able to receive this request from the front end, we're going to send a request to some other API. I think there was a request for the noun project API. So I'm going to grab my keys real quick. I'm going to have to stop sharing momentarily, I think. Okay, here we go. For some reason, like the actual login page is not the easiest thing to find. They have like links kind of hidden in weird places. But anyways, I've created an app for the noun project. Got some keys here. But first, how do I use this thing? Just gonna grab their sample code.
When you say you created an app, is that part of their requirements to use a key?
Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't really like mean much. It's just like an organizational thing.
So is this different from the one you used last time you did the noun project then?
No, this should be a pretty similar demo.
But I mean, is it the same app?
Oh, yeah, it is. In theory, it should be a different app, but it doesn't particularly matter. The idea is that like, if I was using the noun project API for two different applications, and then one of those applications gets hacked, like I could just disable the key for that one application, and then my previous one that didn't get hacked could still continue operating normally. Whereas if I was using one API key for all of my different applications using the noun project, then if one of them got hacked, I would have to rotate my keys. I would have to, disable these old ones and generate new ones, and then have to update all of my other applications to use new keys. So just for your own organization, it's supposed to help you out. But for just these little demos, it doesn't particularly matter. Sound good?
Yes, thank you.
Mhm. All right, so next we need to put in our key and our secret so we can make some requests. Let's see, we're not going to just look for the first icon. We're going to look for the one that they ask for. Because just from looking at the documentation for the noun project, I know you can just search for a word or anything and they'll return it to you. But now it's complaining that there's no module called requests. So we're going to have to install that in order to get this working. Both of these guys, actually, we have to install. So I'm going to double check. I'm still in my virtual environment for electronics.
Also, I want to clarify. So let's say you don't actually end this all in one setting. To get back into it and run it all up and everything, you'd start your virtual environment and then you would reinstall. So you'd activate your virtual environment. Would it all have Django and all of these other things in there already, or would you have to reinstall those?
You would not have to reinstall it. Installing it the first time adds it to your virtual environment. So just activating that virtual environment will again give you access to all of the libraries that you installed to that virtual environment.
Okay, thanks.
Although you're reminding me, if I wanted to share this project with a collaborator, they're not going to have my virtual environment. So I should create a requirements file. So we're going to use pip freeze. And then just for our knowledge, just pip freeze. That just prints out a list of your dependencies. So we're using these two request libraries, authlib, Django, and some other things here I'm not really sure about. So I want to write these into a file. So I use the kind of left angle bracket or right angle bracket, I'm sorry, and pipe this into requirements.txt. So I have this requirements.txt that lists all of the requirements for this project, so that someone else who wants to run this project on their machine just has to do pip install -r requirements.txt, and that's going to recreate the requirements from this file. Let's see here. So we're getting an API response. Yeah, let's just see what that looks like. All right, so this is the body, but it's a string. I need to parse this as JSON. I think this is right. Oh, need to import JSON. So let's try this again. Actually, I'm getting sick of typing into this HTML form. So we're gonna Okay, so now when I load the page, there's already a search term typed in and it's already focused, so I can just press enter. I do think autofocus is nice for user experience, but the real reason why I'm doing this right now is for my own convenience in building this demo. Okay, so now I'm parsing the body. Looks like I'm getting a dictionary. The first key is icon. So we're going to print JSON API response icon. And then inside of icon, I'm looking for preview URL. I'm just looking for things that look like URLs because I need to find a location for an image. And I just know from doing this before that preview URL is what I want. So we submit the form again. And cool. So now it's giving me this URL. Let's just take a look at it. That is a phone. All right. So I'm getting the right data from the API. Now I just need to send this data back to my client. And we send the image URL back. So in theory now, my front end should be able to get the URL for this image. So yeah, we should be logging that response. So let's see what that actually looks like. Response.data, response data URL. Okay, so we're getting that URL back. Dalton, you have a question?
Yeah, I thought just kind of seeing it would help me, but I don't, so like on your line 7 right there, I don't, like, what is the significance of putting like the git/products if you still have to put it in the URLs? Like, what, does that do something that I don't understand?
Put what in the URLs?
So like when you're saying git, but you're not really putting a URL, you're just putting \product or /products.
Mhm.
What does that do since you're putting actually where you want to go in the URLs file?
This URLs file you're saying?
Yes. Like,
So
see how
these,
you have products? Oh, go ahead.
yeah, these are opposite sides of kind of the same operation. So in the main JS, this is my front end actively sending a request out. It's just like shooting off an HTTP request to this location, this URL. And we had better hope that someone is listening in that URL, able to receive our request and send us an intelligent response. So we saw before that we were getting 404 errors from our front end or from the back end because I was sending this request before I had written the code on my server to receive it. So we were just sending a request out to this URL and there was no one prepared to listen for requests at that URL. So in the URLs file, this is just saying all of the URLs on our server that we are prepared to receive requests to. Doesn't mean that anyone's gonna send a request here. I could, create a new path and just not tell anyone about it. And then we would never get a request at this path, even though we're prepared to.
Okay, can I just, based on that, can I just see your views file one more time? Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Justin, question?
Yeah, how come you didn't use OAuth?
Pardon?
How come you didn't use the OAuth 1? Or did you? And I'm just losing my mind.
Request OAuth
Oh, you
lib
did.
for OAuth 1.
Oh, and you pasted it in there directly, but that's not what we're supposed to do, right?
The keys you're saying?
Yeah.
Correct.
Oh, that's the .env thing. Okay.
Yeah. So first I just wanted to get it working, but before I actually commit this, and that's important, before I commit this, I'm going to use python.env to take these keys out of my actual code. But first, we're going to create an image. Actually, let's do this all from the JavaScript. We'll say and this is not something you do very commonly, just like creating images in plain JavaScript or creating any kind of element in plain JavaScript, but feels appropriate for this demo. So I think this works. Not quite. What is the problem here? src equals undefined. So I try to just set it to response data image URL. What should that actually be? Response data. Oh, it's just URL. Okay. Okay, cool. So it looks like that's actually working. Let's say Danielle.
Yeah, sorry, instead of creating the element in the JavaScript, could you just make it in the views and grab it in the layout page, like in the HTML you're building in the back end?
No, I would not do that in this case. The reason is because this HTTP conversation is all just with JSON data. Like, it's because this is an AJAX request. We're not expecting to get any HTML back. The response that I handle in this .then should just be JSON data. And then my front end has to figure out what to do with that. But I'm not expecting to get any HTML back here.
So
Yeah, then the question is with what Dalton was asking about the products. Do we really need the products then in the views if we are doing the response here?
What do you mean? What products?
Right, like you're calling from the JavaScript from the event, you're calling the products in the URLs.
Mm-hmm.
But you're
Right.
not modifying the HTML actually. I mean, so yeah, I guess I'm lost with the connection of like when does it connect the event that comes from the front end, when it connects to the request that you're getting here, and when are you changing the HTML with that? It's really confusing.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing because I thought that I thought I understood it, but then the image showed up on the home page instead of on the products page. And I thought we were trying to send it to a products page.
So
So it
we
sounds
only
like-
have one page.
Yeah, so would you mind, I think it would help all of us just start from, okay, we have our page. This is what makes our page. Now here's our request. This is where, like, the whole process. Would that help everybody? I know it would help me.
Yes.
Sure. So the first thing that happens is, we type into this form, we click submit. So that gets handled by this code over here. Search form on submit. We're going to do all this stuff, grab what they typed in, and then we send a GET request to /products. So on our server, we have two URLs that we can handle. The first URL is the home page. That just sends the HTML that we're looking at here. And then the other page is products. This route does not return HTML. So this isn't like a URL that we would actually navigate our browser to. So localhost, whatever, this is not how the application is supposed to work, because this URL just sends JSON back. The browser doesn't know how to interpret this. This URL only exists for AJAX requests to retrieve data from our server, not a full HTML page. So looking at our views, seeing what that actually does. So here's our products view function. So we're expecting to get AJAX requests here, and we're expecting it to have a query string. And then we use that query string to reach out to the noun project API, which we could not do this from our front end in JavaScript with Axios, because this API does not support cores. So this API just will not give a useful response to a browser. We have to make this request from our backend in Python. And so then after we make this request in Python, the API tells our server the URL of the image that we're looking for. And then we just have to send that URL back to our front end. So then back on our front end, we handle the response from Django in this .then block. And then here we can do whatever our front end needs to do with that data. So in this case,
So could
putting
you, in
images on the page.
theory, have a products HTML page and send that data to that? Because that feels more like what we did the past couple of times.
So it's kind of like an older style of like defining your routes. I think you saw maybe one of your first demos was like that, where you'll have a given URL that on a GET request will send you HTML, and then on a POST request or something else, you can send data to it for like AJAX requests to create new things in your server. I'm splitting things up a little bit differently here. I think this is kind of a more modern way of architecting your application, where I have some routes, such as the home page, are just for sending HTML. And then some routes, like products, are intended to be consumed by AJAX clients like Axios. And these just send JSON back.
So anytime you have any sort of form where you're submitting data, you would have a path devoted just to that process. And the better way to do this is the data would be returned back to the form, the HTML page that had that form.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it goes back to like the JavaScript function that had sent the request. But yeah, like we're sending requests from our front end after submitting the form to our back end. And then our front end just receives the data from our back end, but it doesn't like automatically go on the screen. Because this was an AJAX request, it's still our responsibility as developers to do something with this response and put it on the screen.
So, and just to also make sure that I haven't missed any sort of brief that tells us, or any sort of lecture that has told us how to grab this data, ping a database, and like through a SQL, for example, and say they typed in phone, we have a data. I mean, I know you're using an HTTP request, but like we haven't gone over somebody types in phone, we're going to ping our database and say, okay, let's check our database. Phone is in our own personal database, and that returns this URL. We haven't covered that process, right?
Right, because we have not connected Django to our databases. But honestly, it would be pretty similar to what we're doing here. It's just that, we would place this code in the middle. Instead of sending a request to an API, we send a request to our database, and then send the response to the client. But it's a pretty similar process overall. It's just about who owns that extra data. Is it in our database or someone else's database?
So is it fair to say that in this example, the views function is executed like in the middle of the GET request, I guess, if that makes sense?
These view functions get executed when our server receives the GET request, or any request.
Okay, so maybe also a part that may be confusing me is, so say you wanted to have two different options to make. I don't know if that even makes sense, but how would you put it in your JavaScript file? Would you just have to have two separate functions depending on which, I guess, URL you're trying to call?
Yeah, I mean, I could just have some like if-else logic trying to figure out what this URL is supposed to be. Or different forms might submit to different URLs. It's just depending on your custom, business logic, your particular application's needs.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So in theory, let's just say for kicks and giggles, we didn't want to send this image on the main page. We wanted to send it to a different page like we did last time.
So don't think about it as sending it to different pages. Like I'm on this page when I send the request. The response is going to come back to right here. Like I can send it to a different URL maybe on my server. Like if I want to handle this with like /product search instead of /products, but that doesn't really make any difference to my front end.
So if you send another one, does it get appended or does it replace the phone image?
I mean, the way I've got this set up currently is just going to keep appending to the body.
Okay, and you'd said something a long time ago, and I didn't want to interrupt you at the time, but you made an intuitive decision to use get instead of, I would assume, post. But you just like totally glossed over that. You just said, I think I'm going to use get because of something, and then you kind of went forward.
Mm-hmm.
So you make it sound almost as if that was like a deliberate decision, but both would have worked. So I'm still confused as to when to use get, when to use post.
Yeah. So this is something that we'll talk about more towards the end of the program, but long story short, I am not trying to modify the server state. I'm not asking it to change anything. I'm just asking the server to give me information. So if you're just asking to receive information and you're not telling the server to create, update, or delete any data, you would use a GET request. If you are asking the server to change its data, then you would use some other request type.
So if you wanted to replace an image contents, instead of just continuing to add one, would that be an example of using post or not quite?
So I mean, in this example in particular, like all these images are coming from the Noun project API, and I can't change their data. They'll provide it to me if I want to
Well, I meant
access
like
it.
if you had an image tag on your index.html page and you wanted to keep changing that content, would you then have to use
No.
post or no?
So the difference between get and post is about changes to the server state. You kind of assume that the front end is going to change when you do anything because the client needs to be updated about what just happened. But yeah, choosing get versus post is about what you're asking the server to do.
So is there anything right now in our wheelhouse that we've learned that we would have to use post for? And if so, what have we or should we know to use that?
Not really, because you don't have your own databases, which is naturally where you would post to as you're asking your server to create users or whatever. And most APIs do not support post requests. It's possible that like maybe your bank has an API, and so then you could send post requests to that API to update your own data. But most APIs, you're just accessing the public API data and they won't let you change that. So up until this point, we've had rather few excuses to use post requests or any other type of request. Sound good? All right, so let me see if this actually works. Can we get a phone? No, phones are sold out. Can we get a TV? No, TVs are also sold out. How about fax machine? Faxes are also sold out. Okay, so it's not a very good store, but I think the website is functional at least. Except I need to get my keys out of the views file. So like I was saying before, we're going to do that with a module called python.env. We're going to install it here. So now I can create a file .env. I feel like I'm missing something here. Wait, dang it, where did I? So why is this yelling at me? Do I need to? I don't know. I'm just gonna Google it. Okay, yeah, does it just not like spaces?
In the notes, you have env equals prod before it. What is that?
Just like an example of another
Oh, okay.
environment variable. You know, I want to
one?
say if this is for production or local development.
Okay.
Quotes or semicolons? That's what I would try next.
I'm wondering if my editor is just confused. I'm just going to try this out and see what happens. So in my views, we need doesn't seem like it crashed. So let's try. All right, yeah, so this is my environment. And does it have API key in it? Yeah, here we go. API key and secret key. So those are in my environment. So I can replace these guys here with os.environ. And this here is os.environ secret key. All right, so let's see if this still works. Okay, yeah, so the application still works, even though I've removed my keys from the views file and they're just in this .env. Not exactly sure why my editor is freaking out. I think it doesn't understand what this file is supposed to be, but it is evidently working correctly. So the last thing I need is just a Git Ignore file so that my env does not get committed. This new file, .git ignore, and I say .env. So that prevents this file from being tracked with Git. So at this point, I'm actually going to commit it. Cool. What questions do we have, Alicia?
I was hoping you would go back to that noun project thing and show us their format for how to send requests versus how you did it, just so we can visually see the difference.
This is their sample code.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't show you how to use like environment variables or anything. They just do it the kind of like naive way, putting your keys right in here and just sort of assuming that you've figured out some method of keeping your keys safe.
Okay. And for this API, the only way to use it is to put in, well, because it's showing 1, so I guess you could do it by a phrase or a number.
Let's read the documentation.
Oh, sorry, I thought you knew that. So also while you're doing that, I can't
Yeah,
help
so
but feel like
these
either
are all
you
the different routes they have.
either you just make it look super easy or you manage to find like the most simple API. So going into this, did you like already know how difficult or not difficult the noun API was?
I did not, but it looked easy enough to work with at first glance. So I just tried to dive in and it turned out to be not so bad. So I thought it would be a good one to introduce to the class. I did deliberately choose this because I thought it was easier to use than many other APIs I've worked with.
Gotcha.
Because yeah, you'll find APIs that are just like poorly documented, especially if they don't document the authentication process very well. And so you're not exactly sure what you need to like send and receive in order to like make an authenticated request. It's very frustrating. So I appreciated, the sample code that they give you here. And showing you just all the different requests that you can send and giving you this like playground to play with is really convenient.
Okay, also, this might probably is a naive question, but is it relatively safe to assume it would be the same process regardless of the API, but the endpoint and the query values might change? And then also just the, like maybe where you put your authorization key inside of the query would change? Like
Yeah,
basically lines 27 through 30, is that pretty much going to be the process? Like regardless of the API, and just lines 24 and 25 would change?
pretty much, yeah. So like I was saying, authentication can be different for every API. So this part I only know from reading their documentation. So it's probably a little bit different how you authenticate other APIs. But yeah, for any other API, then you're gonna send a request there, likely a GET request. And then they're gonna give you a response, and you're gonna have to dig through that response for the information you want, and then send that to your client. And actually in the future, this step is probably gonna be done automatically. We're gonna learn other tools in the future that are a little bit smarter for dealing with APIs. And so it's gonna handle the JSON conversion for us. What other questions have we got?
I am just curious. So, is the only reason the dot env, because I guess I just don't understand, since we're doing this all on the back or in the front back end to prevent people from seeing it. So is the only reason you can't see it on the dot env because you're using git ignore? Like, is that
That's correct.
so? Essentially, the only way people can see into your server is through GitHub. So if you don't post it to GitHub, which I don't know if that's possible, no one would be able to do it regardless.
I mean, yeah, but like the code isn't very useful if you don't post it anywhere.
Yeah, I guess I see how that makes sense.
Yeah, they say that like the most secure possible system in like talking about computer security is a machine that is disconnected from the internet and powered off. But of course, that's completely useless also. So
Thank you.
yeah, we want to be able to share our code with other people, but we don't want to share the API keys.
Isn't it a possibility for someone to gain access to the API keys if it was if the code was running on a server? Like a cloud server or something like that they got access to or something like that?
Yeah, so if this was running on a cloud server, yeah, if they had like direct shell access to the machine, they can just like CD and LS around. They could just CD into the folder where the project is at and just look at this .env file. But yeah, you've got to assume that if someone has like direct shell access to your server, like you have been hacked. Nothing else that you do matters pretty much at that point.
I did kind of mean from so if the application was running on a server and you're able to access it from the internet, would you be
Okay.
able to see source code?
Oh, no.
No. Okay.
So yeah, the server is only gonna send files that it's been configured to send. So, that means that we can potentially send this JSON response. We can maybe send this HTML response. And because of, where is it? Because of our static file server, we can also send any file that is in the static folder. So if the env was in the static folder, then yeah, people could request it directly from the front end. But there's no reason why we would do that. That's like the opposite of what we want to do. So yeah, servers won't by default just send any random file that you ask for.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I just meant like if our secret was in like the HTML file or something like that, or like one of the main files that a browser would have access to. That's
Oh.
why it's a bad thing to do. Not just for Git, that's what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, that would definitely be a problem. Don't put anything secretive in the HTML, which
Yeah.
I don't, I've taken a handful of like short classes on hacking, you know, just like learn how to hack web applications. And I always feel like they're kind of dumb and really trivial because always like lesson 1 in those kinds of courses is someone hid the password in an HTML comment. So you just have to like open up your inspector and then see it. Like it's going to be something like, so like solving that first challenge is just opening up your inspector and seeing, oh, the password is admin, like typewriting the HTML comment. I don't know why anyone would do this, but this is apparently like a common enough example that I'm assuming someone must have done this at one point, you know, building the most hackable website ever.
I feel like I've seen that somewhere, which is horrible to see out in the wild, but yeah.
Much of the internet is horrible. What other questions have we got?
Raf, can you go to where you did the out of stock thing? Oh, that was a, oh, okay. What were you using as your determinant there? The inner text? Oh, you gave it inner text. Oh, you just hard coded it in. Okay,
Yeah, everything is sold out. We don't actually have any
Sure.
products.
gotcha.
Raphael, you use the term business logic, and that's new to me. Can you explain what that is, or is it any different from just regular logic or app logic?
I mean, they're pretty similar terms, but I guess I mean that specifically like, I don't know, like the kinds of logic that a product manager would care about. You know, like if there's a non-technical person giving you tickets, there's like a certain level of detail that is just too low level for them to understand because they don't really care about arrays and objects and stuff like that. But there's like a higher level of detail where you're talking about, you know, your users and their accounts and, you know, transferring money and taxes or whatever. That's also application logic, but that's like at a higher level that the business cares about, that like the business would specify how it needs to be done.
Okay, so it's like more simple logic for the user, basically, or for the business person that you're talking to.
Yeah. It's about more of like the human considerations. It's more about like how we make money, I guess, where the promises we've made to the customer, those kinds of things.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. What other questions have we got?
So I'm just trying to understand how it all fits together. So if we were not going to query a backend API, and if we didn't have a database, and if we weren't trying to make a replicatable page or project, would there be any reason for us to use Django, or would we just use regular HTML, JavaScript if we wanted to access a front-end API and CSS Bootstrap?
So you're saying like your backend doesn't store any data, doesn't have a database. We're not using any like backend only APIs. There's like nothing dynamic from the server. Like all the server does is send HTML and CSS and JavaScript down.
Right.
Yeah, you probably don't need Django in that case.
Okay, because I was just thinking like when we go to make our portfolio, if we were going to make it all completely by ourselves, we wouldn't necessarily need to use Django for something that simple.
For your portfolio, yeah, probably not. So like I'll put it this way, like just looking at my index route, there are no variables in here. It doesn't matter what the user requests. Like you can't have a body or a query string. It's just we're sending the index back. And so if I didn't have this other route, if all my server did was just send HTML pages in response to HTTP requests, I probably shouldn't be using Django in that case. There are much simpler servers that you can make that just send HTML in response to HTTP requests. So the reason why I'm using Django is because we're assuming that there's complex logic that might need to happen here. So for example, this products route has some complex logic. So this is, justifying the use of Django. But if I didn't have any backend logic and I was just sending HTML and everything interesting happens on the front end, we don't save any user data, don't need to use Django for that. What other questions have we got? Django does not have built-in DDoS protection. That's kind of not Django's responsibility. Django is starting with the assumption that it has received an HTTP request from the internet, but it's not responsible for actually listening on the internet. It's assuming that there's some other server handing those requests to it and not overwhelming it. So yeah, Django has no built-in DDoS protection. It's just not Django's responsibility. What other questions have we got?
You can still write JavaScript in here to update HTML values similarly, like how we did like 2 weeks ago, I guess, when all we were doing was DOM manipulation and like changing an H1 value. You can still do that in here, right?
In here, you mean?
Well, like in your JavaScript file, you could access something on your index.html file and say like, not only when I type in phone, do I want it to do everything I just told it to, but I also want to give the box a shadow or turn the button blue or something. Like you can still do all that, right?
Yeah, when they submit the form, you can do whatever the heck you want. We're developers. Does that answer your question? I mean, there's nothing stopping you from doing anything, creating elements, changing things that are already on the page.
Yeah, I'm just making sure. Thanks.
Any other questions? Questions? No? Okay. I feel like I've been demoing for a while, answered a lot of great questions along the way. So I think it might be about time for lunch now. When you come back, we're going to have partners for y'all to do some pair programming. And I'd also like to do the retro this afternoon. And then at the very end of the day, we're going to release the assessment, which I know the timing is a little bit weird because you've still got other homework, but you're going to have a lot of time for this assessment. So I think it's all right that you've got a couple homework assignments also at the same time. Maya?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if before lunch, if you're able to, can you push the notes, the files, the folder to GitHub?
Yeah, I can push the notes up. It'll just take a little longer for the video.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Cool. So if there are any more questions, no more questions. All right, so I think that concludes our demo.